The Allure of Rubbing My Cheek on You by mylittlegayass. Summary. 5 times Atsushi accidentally bunted someone, and the one time he did so intentionally. Wait, had Rampo wanted Atsushi to bunt him? Oh, that's so embarrassing to even think about. He hopes none of the others have tried to orchestrate a similar event. The first time Atsushi had even bunted someone, it was only a few days into his life at the agency. Sure, he didn't know what he was doing, and he could only hope Kunikita didn't know either. He'd slept in, something that grew into a decently common occurrence. He wasn't used to having a safe place to sleep, and now having one, his body decided it was best to finally catch up on the years of sleep lost now. And it often turned to one of the agency's members being sent to wake him up, and subsequently deal with his constant apologies. And, far from the last time, it was Kunikita who'd enter his dorm to collect him. Frankly, if it wasn't for the man, Atsushi probably wouldn't have been woken up by most of the other members, except for Yosuno, who called his excessive sleeping worrying the longer it gone on. And well, this time wasn't so different. Atsushi was a light sleeper, but he's far from a morning person, which usually led to Kunikita, disgruntled with how long he was taking to get up, picking him up, and unceremoniously jumping him right back down. Careful enough to not actually hurt Atsushi, or scare him for that matter, but enough to wake him up. But, to Atsushi's future embarrassment, his half-asleep brain knew that Kunikita was, for one, a safe person, and two, he'd grown to enjoy his presence. Much like the rest of the agency for that matter. They were safe people, regardless of all their quirks. And when Kunikita picked him up, as had become normal on the mornings that he'd enter Atsushi's apartment, he swears, he'd shove his cheek against Kunikita's chest and arm. And, oh, Kunikita isn't stupid, and Atsushi swears the other man knew exactly what he'd done. It was common knowledge that cats bunt others, especially to mark safe people, and to form a sense of security. At least, according to that one book on cats he'd read before realizing that he found reading about tigers far easier to understand. Besides, he's not a cat. He's a tiger. But regardless, he was still dropped down and jolted to fully be awake, with a comment from Kunikita about them being late, of course. Even so, he still prays to whatever higher being that might be out there that Kunikita didn't know what he had done, or at least the implications behind it at the time. The second time was to Kenji, surprisingly. Sure, Atsushi hadn't spent much time around the younger boy, given how he was, well, with the amount of attempts on his life and well-being, he hadn't spent much time around the other agency members. But Kenji had dragged him to eat lunch with him, because apparently one of the vegetables, Atsushi isn't sure, he'd planted had a good harvest, and he'd insisted that Atsushi should share with him. Kenji often gave the other agency members vegetables and the like, so this wasn't an odd occurrence. They're both seated in the corner, as Kenji explains every detail of how he cared for the vegetable. Atsushi'd found that he likes listening to the other agency members, even if it is something small like this. He still finds it difficult to talk to anyone but Kyoka. His time in the orphanage had kept him from doing much more than be silent, so speaking to people, even those he knows, was still hard. Even if Kenji's words got more sleep-slurred as the time goes on, and he gets far more tired. They haven't had much going on recently, so Kenji can afford to take naps after he eats lunch, which is also why he usually drags someone else to eat with him, in case he falls asleep sooner than expected. Which is, well, exactly the case at the moment. Kenji's leaning heavily into Atsushi as his words taper off into incoherent, sleep-fueled murmurs. Atsushi's long since finished what Kenji given him to eat, so he's not exactly moving enough to keep the boy from sleeping. Not that he'd want to do that, by the way. Part of him is extremely content with the fact Kenji is alright with resting on him, and Atsushi doesn't want to get rid of that. So when Kenji's head ends up on his chest, Atsushi instinctively rests his head on the boy's, and, without really realizing it, runs his cheek along his hair, messing it up. This time, at least, he knows what he's doing. Or well, the name for it. He'd look into what he'd been doing after Rampa had teased him for chuffing, and he'd figured out that the two main things he'd done were bunting or chuffing. Well, less on the bunting. He'd only done so to Kunikita a few times thus far, but it's still far from a surprise that now it spread to Kenji. Alas, with the realization that he was bunting Kenji, Atsushi grew a tad bit embarrassed. Had he chuffed at all during his lunch break with him? Kyoka was the third Atsushi bunted. They were settled in their dorm watching a movie, because after Yosono made the third Heather's reference in the same day, Kyoka insisted they have to watch it so she'd understand. Which is why they're watching it on one of the agency's laptops that Kyoka procured from somewhere. At least this discovery moment of Kyoka's wasn't like the last one. Atsushi doesn't know how he got dragged into her first sleepover with the girls, but he does know that he hates the feeling of makeup on his face, and especially around his eyes. He chooses to ignore how Kyoka has that photo as his contact image for him. It's better than the one of him asleep in the most odd position in his closet, at least. At the moment, they're laying down together, faces far too close to the screen than they should be, but Kyoka's invested, so that means Atsushi is too. At least, he's trying to be. But there's only so much American, he thinks, high school drama that he can take before he gets confused. Why do 3 of them have the same name? He does not know anything. At least that JD guy seems cool. It's by the climax of the musical. Musical! Atsushi liked the music part of it. He'd never thought Yosono would be the type to enjoy musicals. That Atsushi realized why Yosono likes this particular musical enough to quote it multiple times. The main character seems to, 1, be a badass, and 2, the villain? Antagonist? Is also badass, just in a bad way. And Kyoka seems to like to criticize his decisions, so Atsushi decides he likes it too. She's being more talkative than normal, so he finds that nicer. Something Kyoka had also begun to do was mess with the longer strands of his hair. Apparently, in the sleepover, the girls found out how soft his hair was. As soft as a cat's, Naomi had insisted, and Haruno had agreed instantly. And Kyoka took it upon herself to mess with it once she'd found that as well. It helps her with her dislike of touch, he found. So he never complained. Besides, it feels nice. It was only when she had started to laugh at him that he realized. He'd started to lean pretty heavily into her hand and nudge into it, the action only slightly accelerated by the fact she decided to scratch his chin. Like you would to a cat. And, well, Atsushi can't get mad at her, especially since she'd been trying to stifle her laughter, even against his enhanced hearing. Besides, the chin scratches do kind of feel good. So he relents to the fact she's going to be treating him like a cat for the rest of the night. And to the fact he'll likely keep bunting her hand because, seriously, those chin scratches are wonderful. The 4th person he'd bunted was probably the most embarrassing. After Kunikita, of course. Seriously, he'd barely know the agency at that point. Yosono had insisted she'd do blood work, and honestly, just give him a general checkup so she had something to go off for future situations. Only, what ended up happening was she had to sit behind him. Because his veins rolled away from the needle, and she decided that bending over him while holding his arm in place was best. His arm was numb for the rest of the day, and he doesn't think it was due to the blood being drawn. Before he'd been whisked away, though, Rampo had essentially thrown his hat towards him, and Atsushi cannot help but be thankful for it in the stupidest way. Recently, he'd realized that due to his enhanced sense of smell, he'd found comfort in the general scent of the agency, and it seems that Rampo had realized that much as well. Which means that he'd been using his non-Yosono compromised arm to hold Rampo's hat as close to his chest as he can. Unfortunately, when Yosono's fighting the tiger's regeneration to get a proper blood sample, her scent is not exactly comforting. She does eventually get the needle in him, which is honestly a wonder, and also she finds it in himself to relax. Not enough that he's calmed by Yosono's presence immediately, but eventually he can set Rampo's hat in his lap and lean against her as he watches her draw the blood from his arm. It's sluggish as it moves to the needle, and Atsushi has decided that he does not like the vision of it. So he turns to face Rampo's hat in his lap instead. Yosono has loosened her grip on his arm, but even so, he still felt himself losing feeling in his left hand. He is so lucky he was given the go-ahead to head back to his dorm after this. His entire left arm feels like lead. Eventually, Yosono quietly laughs, dragging him out of his thoughts, and he began to, unknowingly, much like every other time, bunt against her shoulder. At least the fabric of her top is soft, and it doesn't seem to be bothering her, so he doesn't try to intentionally stop. Besides, he'd rather not think about the fact that his blood is being drawn. And if he manages to fall asleep, who's going to mind? Rampo is, actually. Did anyone even think to ask him if he'd like to be bunted by Atsushi? The 5th turned out to be Rampo. Finally, if you'd asked the man himself. Sure, Altoshi didn't realize it was intentional on Rampo's end until afterwards, but it's not like he was thinking about how he'd embarrass himself in front of 4 of his fellow agency members at the time, especially since he had to work around Rampo being sat on his desk now. Not that it was too much of a bother. Rampo was helping, at least in his own way, by pointing out spelling mistakes or judging how he's typing or anything else. It was really only the 2 of them doing anything meaningful at the moment in the office. Kunikita had gone out with Dazai to look into something Altoshi never got the details of. The Tanazaki siblings were at lunch, Yoshino went MIA, not literally, and Altoshi doesn't even want to look into the corner Kenji and Kyoka have commandeered for themselves. Okay, well, what they're doing is remotely meaningful. Altoshi's pretty sure that the document he's trying to complete is Dazai's, which makes some of Rampo's edit suggestions make sense. Word this sentence this way, yada yada. Frankly, he's not even certain why the other's attempting to help him. Right under Dazai, he's probably the agency member who shirks his work the most. But it's not like he minds the assistance. Maybe if he actually gets what he needs done early, he can take Kyoka to that place with limited edition crepes before they sell out for the day. As if sensing his thoughts, Rampo said something along the lines about him asking the cafe to hold 3 back, and Atoshi's already dreading later. Taking Kyoka to a cafe is nothing. Taking Rampo too? That's a whole nother ballpark. Also known as they take more stops because the both of them are window shoppers, and Atoshi is just dragged along. He also dreads the state his wallet will take on later, because all he spends his paychecks on is Kyoka, and the others occasionally, and he already knows that he's going to have to cancel out most of the next few planned outings with her. She won't mind, but he doesn't like the idea. Atoshi pulls himself from his internal economic troubles and tries to focus himself on the paperwork in front of him. It's from some case Dazai dragged him on weeks ago under the guise of training. In reality, he just used Atoshi to break into some warehouse to investigate before Kunikita, causing the blonde to have what can only be described as an aneurysm. And Atoshi is already well aware that he had already did his half of the report a week ago. He's thankful for his newfound decent memory. Kunikita said it was because he feels safer. Yoshino agreed. So he thinks that line of logic is true. It's only once Rampo makes a quiet, only able to be heard by the tiger, hum of pride and what can only be success that Atoshi is dragged out of his line of thought and semi-focused on the laptop in front of his face. He glances up towards his coworker, and that's when he realized he'd begun to bunt against Rampo's thigh. It wasn't a stretch to realize it might happen, with how close he was sitting on Atoshi's desk in the first place, and the fact he'd kept willingly interacting with him. It was a matter of time before he felt comfortable enough to do so. Wait, had Rampo wanted Atoshi to bunt him? Oh, that's so embarrassing to even think about. He hopes none of the others had tried to orchestrate a similar event. The 6th person he ever bunted was intentional, and for the first time, it wasn't an agency member. In fact, it was a stroke of pure luck that Okutagawa had willingly let Atoshi into his apartment. His real one, that is. Not one that was merely a safe house or a hotel he disguised as his own place. He'd fooled Atoshi into thinking such was a fact a multitude of times before this. And it was for a reason that, in hindsight, was fucking stupid. Atoshi's always had a bad relationship with food. In the orphanage, it wasn't like he was fed often, and he'd been starving the first time he'd met Dazai and Kunikita. And then his first time given food, without a limit, he'd essentially binged, and later threw most of it up because his body couldn't handle eating that much at once after so long without. So, maybe he limits himself currently. He doesn't like the idea of puking again. Which brings him to now. Apparently, Dazai had hinted about his lack of eating too many times that Okutagawa took it upon himself to force food down Atoshi's throat. Atoshi's not surprised, per se. The other agency members are worried about his lack of eating, and they tend to take his inability to say no to work against it. So he was dragged by the mafioso to a relatively decent apartment, sitting on the surprisingly comfortable sofa while the other man cooks something. Something that smells pretty darn good. Not as much as chazuke, but still. Eventually, he is joined by the other man holding some sort of food that Atoshi can't name. It's shoved into his hands with the short command to eat. And Atoshi, in his inability to say no, takes a bite. It's good. And hopefully not poisoned, which he doubts. They haven't tried to kill each other in ages. And because, as much as he'd wish otherwise, Okutagawa is likely doing this in an attempt to get into Dalai's good graces. So, Atsushi settles himself into eating. It's easier to focus on the food than anything else, than his and Octagawa's eye bags, the insistent need to focus on his other needs. The thrumming of Byako under his skin, just barely keeping him around because she can tell he's running himself thin. And maybe when he's finished and the plate is gently taken from his hands to be set on the table in front of them, when he's guided by surprisingly gentle hands to lay down against their owner, he listens. He's calm. And if it weren't for his enhanced senses, especially in this state, he likely wouldn't have realized how panicked Octagawa seemed. In a burst of sleepy inspiration, and knowing that doing so had calmed the other agency members, nosing into it as he relaxes. If he gained a hand threading to his hair during the process, he wasn't about to say a word. It's not like he and Octagawa are enemies anymore, and they've gone further than allies. Especially given the nights they'd ended up together after one of them stubbornly insisted on healing the other. Usually Atsushi to Octagawa, but there has been occasions where the scenario had flipped himself on its head. Eventually finding himself comfortable against Octagawa's side, even if the other may not be comfortable, he stops and settles. Octagawa is warm. Added to by how he is always wearing black, and Atsushi can't find it in himself to even pull away from the other man's warmth. It's like a sunspot on a good day. He's embarrassed how comforting he finds them. Kyoka's found him sprawls in the one formed in their living room far too many times to count. Jinko. Don't you dare fall asleep on me. Why not? At least let me get comfortable. Atsushi hums simply in response, rubbing his cheeks harder into Octagawa's shoulder as the other shifts them down to lay on the couch at least. Later, he knows, he'll likely either be carried or woken up, just so they can properly head to bed. But for now, he lets himself fall asleep here. He's safe here too, just as he is in the agency. And he'll let later Atsushi be horrified by that thought when he wakes up. For now, he's comfortable in the arms of his enemy.